This is the second clip on our 6th chapter, that is Security in the Contemporary World. First, let's have a look at the overview of your chapter. Now, we know that there are two different notions to look at the security. First, the traditional notion, which talks about nation security, which we have already done in our first clip. Alright, now if you haven't watched the first part, I've given the link in my description below and you can watch that clip before moving on with this one. Alright, now in this clip, we'll do the second notion, that is the non-traditional notion, which came much later, and unlike the traditional security, which talks about nation security, the non-traditional notion, it talks about human or the global security. So this is the map of non-traditional notion, and in this clip we'll discuss on why the non-traditional concept goes beyond the security of a nation and talks about the human or the global security. All right, and then we'll also discuss about the various news sources of threat to security and the cooperative security. And we'll also discuss about India's security, although it is not in the syllabus, but we never know. All right, so the non-traditional notion, it is much broader concept, because when you talk about the referent in both notions, now referent over here means security for who. All right, so in traditional notion, the referent is state, whereas in the non-traditional notion, it goes beyond state. In the non-traditional security, the referent is not just states, but all human beings. So you're talking about the security of all human beings. All right, and the non-traditional views of security have been called human security or global security. Now, the first one, human security. Human security refers to the protection of people from any type of threats more than the protection of states. So we usually think that the human security and state security is same, because a secured state would mean secured citizens, right? But then this is not true. In the history, more people have been killed by their own governments than by foreign armies. So the supporters of human security say that its primary goal is the protection of individuals. But then there was difference in view regarding what exact threats should the individuals be protected from. And this actually has led to two concepts, that is the narrow concept and the broad concept. All right, now the narrow concept, it focuses on violent threats to individuals. So here the threat is violent. Maybe we can give the example of a war. All right, and the broad concept, the supporters of this concept, they argue that besides the threat from violence, the threat should also include hunger, poverty, disease, and natural disasters, because we know that if we compare the killings of people by war, genocide, and terrorism all combined together at one site, and killings of humans by disasters in the form of hunger, disease, and natural disasters on the other side, then the number would be more in terms of the killings by the disasters. All right, so the disasters kill more people than violence. So it is much broader concept where you consider both the threats, the violent threat as well as the disasters. And then we have the second one, global security. Now the idea of global security, it emerged much after, that is in 1990s, in response to the global nature of threats such as global warming, environmental degradation, international terrorism, and health epidemics like AIDS, bird flu, and so on. Now, one of the main reasons for this global security threat is due to globalization, and we'll learn all about globalization in our last chapter. All right. We must understand that since these problems are global in nature, international cooperation is necessary, because no individual country can face or can resolve these problems alone. The best example would be the present COVID-19 problem, which has actually become a global threat and where the international cooperation is necessary to combat or to contain this disease. And in some situations, one country may have to disproportionately bear the brunt, or you can say become the victim of a global problem such as environmental degradation. For example, due to the global warming, a sea level rise of 1.5 to 2 meters would actually flood 20% of Bangladesh, and also most of the Maldives, and it also threatens nearly half the population of Thailand. Okay, so since these problems are global in nature, international cooperation is a must and it's a necessary. Sources of threat. Now, both the human security and the global security focus on the changing nature of threats to security. Fine. So, some of the new sources of threats are terrorism, human rights, global poverty, migration, and epidemics. We'll go one by one. Now, the first one, terrorism. Terrorism refers to systematic use of brutal violence that creates an atmosphere of fear in society. It is used for many purposes, very prominently the political, religious purposes. I've taken this explanation from the CBSE reference that they have provided. So when you talk about terrorism, you can clearly see that you're talking about a systematic use of violence. All right. And the main aim of using these violence is to create an atmosphere of fear. So they are basically trying to create a fear in society, and they use this terrorizing people for many purposes, especially for the political, religious purposes. For example, jihad, or you can say the holy war of Islam, where terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they fight against various governments with the belief that these governments are being unfair to the practice of their religion, or let's say to their religion as such. Okay, so there could be three broad meanings of terrorism. The first one is a systematic use of terror, which is often violent. They use this especially as a means of coercion, or you can say it's a method to force the governments to listen to their demands. And the second one is the violent acts to achieve their goals. The terrorists, they also use violent acts which are aimed towards creating fear or terror. And for this, they purposefully or they deliberately target the civilians. They carry out these violent acts to achieve their religious, political, or ideological goals. Okay, and the third one we have is the acts of unlawful violence and war. Now, the acts of terrorists are, of course, unlawful. Their way of inflicting violence are against the international norms. Okay. The most common used methods of terrorism involves hijacking planes or planting bombs in trains, cafes, markets, or you can say any other crowded places. In this world, there is not even a single nation that does not suffer from terrorism. Okay, so terrorism has now become a global problem. We've also international terrorism, which involves the citizens or territory of more than one country. Although some countries they've tried to divide terrorism into good and bad terrorism, it's important over here that India has always denied this distinction, especially India's Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, that is Mr. Narendra Modi. He has also clarified that terrorism cannot be divided into good or bad. Okay, it's a global problem, and all he says that terrorism is always bad and it's a global problem, and that all the countries they should collectively stand against terrorism. Second threat we have is the human rights. Now, human rights are those basic conditions to which every individual is entitled as a human being for his or her fullest development. So basically, being a human being, you are entitled to certain basic rights, and that's just human rights. Okay, now the human rights can be classified into three types. The first one we have is the political rights, which includes rights such as freedom of speech and assembly. Okay, then we have got the second right, that is economic and social rights. And the third one, the rights of colonized people or the ethnic and indigenous minorities. For example, you can say the rights of Tibetan people in Tibet, or as in the case of India, you can give the example of rights of scheduled tribes in India, or in America, the Red Indians. All right. Now, the human rights violations, it is found at a very large scale, and most of the times it is actually the government that violates the human rights of their own people. So it should be very easy for us to understand this threat, because we Tibetans, we have been facing genocide and we have been facing human rights violation. The Tibetans in Tibet, we know, are not even allowed to express themselves freely, besides not being allowed to practice religion. Okay, and besides ourselves, we can also cite the examples of genocide in Rwanda, or Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, or even the killing of people in East Timor by the Indonesian military, which has been given in your textbook. All right. Now, although there's a broad agreement on this classification, that is the political rights, economic and social rights, and the right of colonized people, but then there is no agreement on which set of rights should be considered as universal human rights and what should be done when there is human rights violation. All right. Moreover, there also is a debate going on whether the United Nations should intervene to stop human rights abuses or not. Okay, so first, the human rights violations is happening, as I said, in almost all the countries, but then in which countries and on which instances will the United Nations act on is decided by the powerful countries based on their national interests. So the powerful countries, they'll focus and they'll influence the United Nations to act on those countries facing human rights violation in which they find national interest. All right. So if the powerful countries do not see any national interest in one of the countries where human rights violation is going on, they'll just ignore it. So I think the fact that the Tibet's issue is gaining attention these days, especially in the era of the COVID-19, is because of the national interest that is there. Okay, the second one we have is the second debate is, although there are various international communities such as Amnesty International and human rights that work towards assuring human rights to people, but then the question is, how far are they effective? Okay, and the third one we have is the global poverty. Now, global poverty is one of the important sources of insecurity. All right. The World Bank has set the global poverty line to $1.90 per day, which means that any person whose income is less than $1.90 per day is considered to be living under poverty. Now, in 2015, 10% of world's population were living under the poverty line. Okay, and for the past few years, the global poverty rate has decreased, which is actually good. But then as a result of the COVID-19, they say that the poverty rates will increase again due to the fall in global economy, which is bad. So the COVID-19 has a direct link to the extreme poverty, okay, in the future times. And then the global poverty also has led to the huge gap between the north and south, which is caused many problems. In order to understand this, let's have a look at the map to have better understanding. Okay, so now if you look at this map, closely, you'll see that all the green ones are the countries in which the poverty level is very low. And you can clearly see that it is in the northern part. You see over here, all these countries, they're mostly green in color. Now, as the pink color becomes darker, it indicates more poverty. And you can clearly see the poverty is far more in the southern part of the hemisphere. So that's why we say that global poverty has led to a huge gap between north and south. Now you might ask, why this huge gap? Right. Well, the population is rising at a very fast pace, and the surprising part is that half of the world's population growth occurs in just six countries, that is, India, China, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Moreover, the population is also expected to triple or increase 3 times in the next 50 years in the world's poorest countries. So, since these countries have low incomes, and with high population growth, that is less money and more mouths to feed, it makes these poor countries get even poorer. And most of these poor countries are located in the southern hemisphere, as we have just seen earlier. But then on the other side, the rich countries or the northern countries, they have got higher income and they even face shrinkage in its population growth. So high income with low population growth makes these countries even richer. And this difference between the north and the south has led to the huge gap, in the world. And as I said earlier, the difference is also the cause to many other world problems, because most of the world's armed conflicts takes place in these poorest countries. So in order to escape the poverty and the conflicts, they migrate, which leads again to migration problem, which is again another global problem. Okay. The next one we have, of course, is the migration. Now, migration is caused by a number of factors, including poverty, lack of employment opportunities, war, political persecution, or natural disasters. And as I just mentioned earlier, the poverty in South has led to a large-scale migration to the North to seek better life. All right. The armed conflicts in the south have also led to millions of refugees seeking to a safer place. We have already studied in chapter number 2 how the Arab Spring has led to the huge migration to other European countries and the problems caused by this migration. Okay. We must also understand that the international law has made a distinction between the migrants and refugees. Now, the migrants are those who voluntarily leave their country. For example, Nepali or Bangladeshi people who come to India to settle, seeking jobs. And refugees are those who are forced to leave their countries due to war. Okay, we are the best example. All right, we have left our country because of war and because of genocide. And besides genocide or besides war, the reason could also be natural disasters or political persecution. All right. Now, the states, although they do not need to accept migrants, but then they're supposed to accept refugees. Okay. And then we finally have the epidemics as a threat to security. Now, since we are living the COVID-19 pandemic, which has confined us to the 4 walls of our home and which has killed more than 5 lakh people, more than actually wars, I think we can best explain this one. Now, in this globalization, in which the world has become so small due to the active movements of people, ideas, capital, and commodities, the health epidemics are very serious threats to the world's security, because health epidemics such as COVID-19, the HIV/AIDS, bird flu, SARS, etc., they have rapidly spread across countries through migration, through business, tourism, and military operations. So, a country's success or failure in limiting the spread of these diseases affects infections in other countries. For example, China's failure in limiting the spread of coronavirus has resulted in the death of more than 5 lakh people and more than 1 crore infected people. Leave aside the effect it had on world economy. And also we see how all the countries are trying their best to cooperate and help each other, because in this globalized world, all the countries are interdependent, and especially in cases such as epidemics, international cooperation is must so as to solve the world's problem in general, and of course yours as well in particular. Okay. Now, we have already seen that to deal with these threats, cooperation is needed. All right, more than military confrontation, cooperation is needed. So, the first one we have is the international cooperation or cooperation amongst nations. The cooperation can be bilateral, it can be regional, it can be continental, or it can be global. It all depends on the nature of the threat and, of course, the willingness and the ability of the countries to respond. But then, yes, international cooperation is needed, be it at different levels. And then, second one is the need of regional and international organizations such as United Nations, WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., because they play a very significant role in these threats. And third one we have is the non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International, Red Cross, private foundations and charities, churches and various religious organizations. Then we have got trade unions, various associations, different social and development organizations, businesses and corporations, and of course, great personalities. They also play a huge role. For example, Mother Teresa has played a very important role, and for us Tibetans, the living example, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. How, like, what better example could you give? So, people such as these great personalities, they also play a huge role in these international corporations. Okay, they play a huge role. So you see, the major response to the threats here is cooperation. The final would be use of military force. Now, although cooperative security may also use force, but then this would be their last option. We should remember that. They would use this force against the governments that kill or ignore the misery of their own people, and against international terrorists. We have this United Nations peacekeeping force. But then we must remember that use of military force over here would be the last option. Okay. Then we'll talk about the India's security strategy, or you can say what type of security has been given priority in India, or what are the basic or broad components of India's security strategy. Now, in India, both traditional and non-traditional notions of security have been given equal priority, because India has faced traditional and non-traditional threats to its security that have emerged from within as well as outside its borders. Okay, for example, it has faced security issues from Pakistan. It has faced certain wars. It has fought certain wars with Pakistan, and it has also faced various secessionist movements inside India as well. So its security strategy has 4 broad components. The first one is strengthening military capabilities. Now, India tried to strengthen its military capabilities because it has been involved in conflicts with its neighbors, like war with Pakistan, as I just said, in 1947. Then we have got the 1965, and of course 1971 and 1999, and with China in 1962. So it is surrounded by nuclear armed countries, and this was the reason why India also conducted a nuclear test in the year 1998. And the justification India gave for this nuclear test was safeguarding national security. And the second one we have is strengthening international organizations. Now, India's security strategy has been to strengthen international norms and international institutions. India has always been a great supporter of all the United Nations initiatives, and it has full faith in the United Nations and has always supported the activities of the United Nations. India also has taken various initiatives to bring about a universal and non-discriminatory regime. The uh, the Prime Minister, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, he supported the cause of Asian solidarity, decolonization, the disarmament. And we, of course, know that instead of joining any bloc during the Cold War, India preferred to follow the policy of non-alignment. Okay, and then we have strengthening the internal security. Now, in India, there are several militant groups, for example, in Nagaland, Mizoram, and Punjab, and of course in Jammu and Kashmir, who have tried to secede or who have tried to break away from India. So, in order to preserve the national unity, Indian government, they have adopted a democratic method to deal with these separatists by giving them freedom of speech and expression. But then they were also at the same time firmly told that there can be no compromise when it comes to India's unity and security. Okay, and then finally, we have the economic and social development. And now India has been making great efforts to develop economy in such a way that the problems of poverty, unemployment, illiteracy, and inequality are solved. Thus, India has launched many programs to combine economic growth with human development. Now let's have a quick recap. In this clip, out of the two notions on security, that is the traditional and non-traditional notion, we discussed about the non-traditional notion at length, which basically talks about security of human beings. We talked about how the referent or the security for who is a human being over here, and how human security is divided into two concepts, that is narrow concepts, which talks about violent threats, and broad concepts, which talks about threats such as disease, hunger, human rights, and etc. We also talked about the global security, which came much later and which is all about global problems affecting the humans, such as global warming, environmental degradation, international terrorism, and epidemics. Under the new sources of threat, we talked about how terrorism, human rights, global poverty, migration, and health epidemics are a threat to the very existence of human beings. And in order to deal with these threats, cooperation is necessary, and thus we discussed how there is need for cooperation, the role of regional and international organizations, the NGOs, and finally the military force, which of course is the last resort when all the other methods fail. Finally, we talked about India's security strategy, which has been broadly divided into four components. Okay, so that's it. This is all about chapter number 6, that is security in contemporary world. This is a short chapter and a very easy chapter if you know certain basic concepts. Okay, so until I see you in my next video, take care and bye bye.